Oh, hello. Hi, everyone. You must be here for the Q&A. Great. Let's do it. Office hours. Maybe cheesy beginning, but it's fun. Greetings, salutations, namaskars. We have some great questions today, and excited to get into some of these topics with you. Yeah, really good questions this time. So thank you all for submitting today. Oh, before we get to the questions, little announcements. We have tomorrow a bonus Near Enemies webinar, and this bonus webinar is on the topic, I am my own guru, and how that is a near enemy to the truth. So if you are subscribed to the Near Enemies series, you'll get the link, or maybe it's the same link as always. Anyway, it's at the same time as always. So hope to see you there. Number 2, on my Patreon page these days, I'm offering Sanskrit lessons. There's many other things on the Patreon page, like guided meditations and seminars on Abhinavagupta's teachings around Shaktipat and spiritual awakening. But also I'm offering Sanskrit classes now on Patreon. And ultimately, it would be really, really cool if people could learn Sanskrit, a few people, right? So in this community we have, depending on how you count it, 10,000 people, 15,000, whatever. It would be cool if a few of them could learn Sanskrit. I mean, this is a personal fantasy of mine, to be able to kind of read primary sources with some of you, and might benefit all beings. Who knows? Maybe you end up doing your own translations. Maybe you end up doing great translations. But anyway, just to have more people in the community conversant with the language. Now, I want to mention also that some people just have gotten the wrong idea that it's just one of the hardest languages ever. No, I mean, it's a classical language, so it's hard, but it's not that hard, you know. Really, anyone who puts in truly dedicated effort can learn the language in about 2 years, and then it takes another, 8 or 10 years to really become fluent in it, if you want. But really, you can be reading the Bhagavad Gita in original Sanskrit in 2 or 3 years if you put in the effort. Or if you put in less effort, it takes more time, obviously. Just saying, it's not true that it's this impossibly difficult language. It's just moderately difficult. Sort of around the same level as classical Greek, if any of you have learned that language, which is unlikely, I suppose. Okay, but this also kind of led me to consider this thing about giving back. Like a lot of people have expressed gratitude for the teachings and gratitude for the teachers who put in a lot of work to be able to offer the teachings in a cogent form and translate them from the original and refine their ability to teach and articulate and all that stuff. And so, I just thought I'd mention that there is a traditional teaching on how you give back to your teacher, right? Which is any of your teachers, right? And I think any teacher of this type of stuff, authentic spirituality, would say the same thing. That to give back, the number one thing is to actually learn the teachings, embody the teachings, and display the benefits of the teachings and transmit them to others. That's the hugest gift you could possibly give any of your teachers. So some people are just, people have different motives, you know, and some people, they find that they can't be motivated to really practice if it's just for them, if it's for their own sake, but they can be motivated to really practice if it's for the benefit of all beings, or it's to offer a gift to their beloved teachers, you know, who have given so much. So that's certainly, I mean, I'm talking also about myself in relationship to my beloved teachers, right? I do what I do, you know, partially out of the desire to give a gift to them. So anyway, live the teachings, embody the teachings, you know, do the practices for the benefit of all beings, and transmit them to others, whether that's by just through your conduct, through your graceful and, you know, loving conduct, or whether that's through translating primary sources, right? Not everyone has to be loving necessarily. There's many ways to transmit the teachings, you know. Anyway, so just a few words about that. I thought I'd just share a few words about that. And now we're ready for the questions and possibly some answers. Okay, Kaushalya says, in response to Vijnana-Bhairava-tantra verse 108, right? This is the verse that teaches not to believe your thoughts, not to entertain thought constructs, not to assemble thought constructs. And she says, in response to that verse, I understand I can't believe in my limited thoughts about myself and simultaneously identify with the Supreme Self, Paramatman. But I do have both, if I'm honest, and I'm trying to hold it all by seeing the contraction also as part of the divine. I also want to be authentic and in my stuff and not spiritually bypass. Otherwise, I can't move through it. Does that work too? Well, not exactly. So this raises a pretty important topic, which, you know, I haven't fully organized my thoughts around, but it is pretty darn important. These days in spiritual communities, including this one, people are so concerned, one might say, about this issue of spiritually bypassing that, and let me take a moment to define that. Well, it would take more than a moment, but essentially spiritual bypassing is when you use non-dual teachings to avoid looking at whatever is uncomfortable or unresolved in yourself, and thereby, you know, decrease your potential benefit to all beings, you know, because you have unresolved stuff, right? And then kind of justifying that overlooking, that blind spot, or that bypassing with spiritual philosophy. And this is indeed problematic, and indeed it did go on and still does in many communities. But now, in a sense, the pendulum has swung too far the other way. And in multiple spiritual communities, basically what's happening is people have lost sight of awakening and liberation as an actual real possibility for this life. And now that's fine. It depends what spiritual path you're on. But if you are practicing in an Asian spiritual tradition, or if your practice is based on a lineage that comes from, you know, that region, South Asia and so on, then to lose sight of awakening and liberation as a legitimate and possible goal, a legitimate possibility for this very lifetime, is to, in a sense, fall off the path, you know. And here's what I've been seeing, which is a little bit disturbing, is that people, and this comment from Kaushalya, sorry to make you an example, but it's kind of exemplifying this, right? She says, I want to be authentic and in my stuff. Well, but from a spiritual point of view, that's a very problematic statement, and a kind of orientation that seems almost guaranteed to prevent you actualizing your goal, because you're calling it my stuff. You're claiming ownership. The thing is, and I understand this is a slippery slope and a delicate subject, but you don't need to claim ownership of anything in order to caretake it, right? Just like if you're staying at a retreat center and you caretake the garden for a day or a week, right? You don't need to claim ownership of it to caretake it, do you? And in the same way, it's problematic to either claim ownership or deny ownership of any aspect of your experience, okay? And there's also a kind of, there's a deeper point here, which is that a big part of awakening is precisely about realizing that self, if it's found anywhere, is certainly not found in the contents of thought, right? So awakening is first and foremost waking up out of the notion that the contents of thought define or describe you, right? So if that's not happening, then awakening isn't happening, right? And by the way, it's possible to spend decades on the spiritual path and yet awakening has not yet begun. Now, if one hears that and one's ego rankles, well, that would just prove my point all the more, right? Because it's perfectly possible to be on the spiritual path in a religious sort of a way. That is, to be engaging in a spiritual tradition in a religious sort of a manner and not quite realize that that's what you're doing. So a lot of people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, but actually they're religious, right? And this is, again, a complex and subtle matter. But awakening, again, it's many things. It's not really many things, but it has multiple aspects. But first and foremost, awakening is waking up out of the false belief that the contents of thought and emotion define or describe you. Waking up out of the belief that the contents of thought have anything to do with who you really are. Really let that sink in if you haven't yet. Waking up out of the belief that the contents of thought have anything to do with who and what you really are. Or emotion, right? So in that sense, waking up is bypassing the ordinary sense of human identity, the accepted and culturally constructed sense of human identity, right? So, as somebody wrote a blog about this, like if you're not bypassing, you're not waking up, right? But again, it depends on how you're using the word. Because this is not about just kind of avoidance of what's uncomfortable. This is about realizing what you are and what you aren't, on the fundamental level. And then going back to caretake or resolve or heal whatever kind of aspects of body-mind need resolution or healing, if any, right? See, because you can't actually even know what aspects of body-mind might need healing until you've woken up, or at least, got some traction in that process. Because so much of what you thought was so kind of important and so selfie, just falls away in the awakening process. So much of that just shears off and falls away and self-destructs. And so you don't even know until it's a matter of sort of going back and revisiting from an awakened perspective and seeing what actually needs resolution, what actually needs healing, right? Because a lot of it sorts itself out anyway. So what a lot of people are doing who are concerned about spiritual bypassing is they're actually deleting spirituality. They're actually deleting the spiritual project from their life and imagining wrongly that you've got to finish your therapy before you can wake up. And that, from a spiritual point of view anyway, is a kind of serious untruth, you know, and one could make other arguments about that. We're getting interesting lighting here as the sun comes through the leaves, but maybe it's okay. So Kaushalya talks about, you know, I'm trying to hold it all by seeing the contraction also as part of the divine. No, you don't need to hold it all. Yes, see contraction as part of the divine, because it is, you know, because everything is. Contraction is no less divine than expansion, right? And essence, nature already knows that. It's the mind that has a hard time getting that, you know. But you don't need to hold it all, right? So this thing about holding it all is like about trying to maintain two identities. There's my God self, and then there's my ordinary self. Please don't try to do that, right? That just leads to a kind of, you know, dissociative identity disorder, basically, you know, in one way or another, right? But you don't need to hold any identities at all, right? Waking up is not about forming a new and better identity and then moving between the two, or trying to, you know, get rid of one and embrace the other. It's going beyond identity altogether, you know. So you know, it's important, like I talked about in the webinar that we did last weekend. What was that? Oh, all paths lead to the same goal, near enemy. It's important to get absolutely crystal clear on what your goal is and how this whole thing kind of works, you know, because otherwise it's very easy to, you know, do the spiritual path as a religion or just spin your wheels and not really make any progress, right? So it's perfectly possible, and, you know, this is a bit of a downer, I think, for some people, but it is perfectly possible to be sitting in meditation every day, even for hours a day, and be getting nowhere with the process of awakening. So you can't imagine that if you just like punch your time card, you know, and log your hours, that you're on your way. You need orientation. You need very clear, precise, explicit orientation to your goal and to the way the process, you know, works. I'm speaking from experience too. I spun my wheels for many years, you know, before finally understanding kind of mature, with the help of teachers, understanding matured in such a way that it was like the spinning wheels finally touched ground and the vehicles started moving. Okay, there's even more I could say about this, but there's other great questions, so I will move on. And this will be a little bit of a longer Q&A session than some others because we do have just such great questions. Someone in the live feed, Shraddha, says, isn't the questioner talking about wanting to deal with samskaras? Yeah, everybody asks about how to deal with samskaras, and they're asking the wrong question. And until the awakening process is well underway, this question about how do I deal with and how do I resolve samskaras is the wrong question, you know. If it was about just resolving samskaras, I would say kill yourself, because that resolves most of them right there from this life. You know, you carry over a handful to the next life, maybe. But it's not just about resolving samskaras. That's not how we awaken, right? resolving samskaras does play a part in the awakening process, which is that once you've, recognized your true nature, digesting and resolving samskaras helps you to abide in your true nature as your default state, because samskaras, as it were, these unresolved past experiences hanging out in your system energetically, they tend to pull you out of abiding in essence nature and back into habitual kind of modes of existence, or habitual modes of perception. So they constitute a kind of gravitational pull, and that's why many people need to resolve them. But again, it's not even from a spiritual point of view, and this is a spiritual point of view, right? It's different from a psychotherapeutic point of view. It's different from a how to be a functional human, or at least look like one, point of view. This is a spiritual point of view in which the question is the wrong question until you've recognized your true nature. Really viscerally recognized it, not just, oh, I get it, in my head. Okay. Next question. And this is related to this VBT 108. Who asked this? I think Margit. Observing thoughts and not believing them. Or no, this was Maureen asked this. Observing thoughts and not believing them has shifted the vibe in my mind so much for the better. Does there come a time when this is automatic? Or is this something we continue to practice until the end? Automatic is maybe not quite the right word. There does come a time when this is effortless, right? Not believing thoughts, or seeing through your thoughts, or seeing through the illusion that a thought is something you need to kind of deal with, or an emotion is something you need to handle, right? Yes, there comes a time when that is effortless, right? A thought arises. There might be a little bit of movement of the mind towards believing in it, but then you sort of catch it in the act, and that movement suddenly dissipates, and the thought is not believed, And no thought should be believed, right? Because thoughts are not truths. Thoughts are tools, at best. Mostly they're just random noise. But the best thoughts are tools. None of them are truths. So you don't need to ask this question of which thought should I believe, because the answer is none of them. But the important question is which thought is a useful tool? Which thoughts help me communicate with others in such a way as to foster a successful connection or a deepening of insight? And true insight is always wordless, but we can point towards it with words and then possibly land in some wordless insight, right? So thoughts are tools, and spiritual teachings are thoughts, and they're the best tools, right, if they're articulated well. But yeah, the time lag, we could call it the time lag between the arising of a thought and seeing that it's just a thought, not something to be believed or disbelieved. That time lag shrinks until it's just a moment, or nothing. Okay. Next question. Rowan asks, did Nāda Yoga, the yoga of sound vibration, evolve from tantric practices? Yes. Or does it have separate and independent roots? No. Nāda Yoga is a tantric term, in fact. Of course, mantric practice dates way before Tantra. Mantra practice goes all the way back to the beginning of South Asian civilization, right, 4,000 years back. But, well, actually, that's not the beginning. But that's about how far back mantric practice goes. But anyway, Nāda Yoga specifically is a tantric practice. And Rowan says, I ask this question because spanda and resonances feature heavily in my practice and is my primary expression when guiding sittings. Okay, so there's a common misunderstanding that spanda has something to do with vibration because Mark Dishkovsky translates it that way. He famously published The Doctrine of Vibration and the stanzas on vibration, two seminal books in this field of tantric studies. But that's not the sort of vibration we're talking about there. Spanda does not mean vibration in anything like a mantra sense or anything like a Nāda Yoga sense. Spanda is the fundamental vibration or pulsation of consciousness itself. Spanda is the innate dynamism of consciousness, the principle by which consciousness oscillates through cycles of expansion and contraction, right? So spanda is the principle that allows us to say every contraction is followed by expansion, and every expansion is followed by a contraction, though the specific kinds of contractions and expansions might and do change over time. And spanda is also the principle, it's taught in the Spanda-kārikās, is the text that originates that, the 9th century tantric text that originates that word. And their spanda also means the kind of spontaneous arising from pure consciousness of various phenomena and thought forms and moods in different states. And so there's a whole practice of really paying attention to the arising of each new energy state and sort of seeing, well, where's that actually coming from? And thereby tuning into the ground of being. Or conversely, following any dissolving state of consciousness, any dissolving mood or thought, following it, as it were, into that which it dissolves into, right? The formless ground of being is what the thought or mood or state of consciousness dissolves into, and out of which it is born. And it's very, very subtle because that formless ground of being is not a thing. It's not an object. You can't objectify it within your experience, but you can start to discern, subtly discern, that from which all these phenomena of experience are arising, especially kind of moods or energy states or thoughts, and that into which they dissolve. That's what spanda is about, in a nutshell. And then, Rowan talks about what features heavily in his practice is feeling into the energetic signatures of light, sound, visualizations, and that sort of thing. Well, to be honest and to be frank, this sort of practice is, in fact, bhoga-oriented. If it's successful, it results in more happiness in life. It results in, that you enjoy life more. It doesn't actually result in awakening, right? You can have very beautiful sorts of experiences by cultivating the innate capacity within consciousness for synesthetic experience, sounds generating light, light generating sound, visual and oral dimensions overlapping, and perceiving kind of beautiful patterns of consciousness within the domains of sound, light, and somatic sensation. And all of that is absolutely fascinating. It just doesn't directly have to do with waking up. I'll have to just move on because we haven't, I'm building up to the big questions here, and it's already been a bunch of time. Okay, so someone asks, I don't have the names. Oh, Johnny asks, how does Matrika differ from Mālinī, and what is the significance? Especially considering Abhinavagupta gave high honors to this scripture called the Mālinī-vijayottara-tantra. personally, I feel that he did so because it highlights the importance of embodiment, and this is why it became the centerpiece of the Trika. Okay, so there's a lot one could unpack in this question, but this scripture, never published in a complete English translation, the Mālinī-vijayottara-tantra, was made the centerpiece scripture in Abhinavagupta's kind of huge intellectual and spiritual project of explicating the entire tantric tradition in his Tantraloka and Tantrasara, because, well, for a bunch of reasons, but one of the main reasons that he made the Mālinī-vijayottara the central scripture in his exegesis is because of chapter 18 in that text, a Kaula chapter, which really serves Abhinavagupta's kind of pedagogical purposes, because in this chapter it's taught that the truth is hidden everywhere, and that you can even read dualistic scriptures. You can even read the scriptures of other traditions and other lineages and explicitly dualistic scriptures and find these gems of truth hidden there, right? And so Mālinī-vijayottara-tantra chapter 18 talks about, the oil, the sesame oil hidden in the sesame seed and stuff like that. And that in the same way, the truth is hidden everywhere, in the patterns of nature, in the scriptures of the dualists, all this sort of stuff. And so for Abhinavagupta, that becomes a very important teaching that he can leverage for his own, spiritual pedagogical purposes. And then this passage in chapter 18 about, in our way, nothing is forbidden, and nothing is enjoined, or everything is forbidden and everything is enjoined, depending on the person, for whom and when principle. So Mālinī chapter 18 teaches this for whom and when principle, and says ultimately, kind of the big reveal there is that whatever enables you to focus your mind, your attention, your awareness on reality, that is the practice you should undertake. So I talk about this in Tantra Illuminated, pages something or other. It's at the end of the philosophy section. I think it's in the innate structure of reality chapter. Pretty sure. Okay, so now, Johnny said, this text highlights the importance of embodiment. Well, for the most part, it doesn't. It doesn't so much, but certainly Kaula sources in general highlight the importance of embodiment. And then he asks again, how does Matrika differ from Mālinī? Too complicated to get into now, but Matrika is essentially, it's the mantra of the Sanskrit alphabet in its normal order, I, u, and so on. That's Matrika. It's the alphabet, the Sanskrit alphabet, recited as a mantra. And then Mālinī is also the Sanskrit alphabet, but in a secret order, not the normal alphabetical order, but a secret mixed up order that begins with na and ends with pa. And that special secret order is mapped onto the practitioner's body as the sort of sonic body or synesthetic soundlight body of the goddess that then is activated within the practitioner's body. So that is very significant to the Trika, this Mālinī mantra. Moving on. Carla says, given that being awake will have some good side effects in everyday life, up to and possibly including making life really blissful, why would one not wish to be reborn in a human body? Well, who wishes to be reborn? I mean, the thing is, there's a contradiction in the question itself, right? given that being awake has the side effect of bliss, wouldn't you want to be reborn? No, because if you're fully awake, there's no you to want to be reborn, right? I mean, that's a little bit. I mean, the thing is that desires can still arise in the awakened paradigm, but they don't. They're in relation to perceived realities. They're not in relation to imagined realities, right? Which by definition are not real or are only theoretically possibly real, right? So, yeah. I mean, if the drop merges into the ocean, and then you say, I wish to pick out that drop again, how are you going to do that? Right? This is why, from the traditional point of view, you know, when some charlatan claims to be the reincarnation of a fully awakened or liberated being, that's automatic evidence that they're not. You know, like, you know, I don't want to name names, but I will. You know, so there's this guy, you know, the famous as the guru with the big afro, Satya Sai Baba, who claimed to be the reincarnation of Sai Baba of Shirdi. And, you know, from a traditional point of view, just the very claim itself disqualifies him as a guru, you know. But anyway, that's, we won't get any more into that topic. Just that point. The drop is merged into the ocean, and you say, I want to pick out that drop again. Okay, pick any drop. Who's reincarnating? Okay. Next one. Can one condition one's self into awareness and liberation? I suppose with practices, yes, but what about rationalizing oneself to those states? Answer, no. As one of my teachers says, you can't think your way to enlightenment. No way, no how. No, you can't condition yourself into awareness and liberation. You can condition yourself to talk about it well, but that's a completely different thing. Then this person asks, maybe this was Margaret, does there have to be an episodic event, or is gradual realization possible? Yes, gradual depends on what you mean by realization. Look, if recognizing essence nature can only happen in a moment, because essence nature is not does not exist in partitions. You know what I mean? It doesn't exist in parts. It's one. So recognizing essence nature, whether you're fully aware that you've recognized it or not, is a one. It can only happen in a moment. But when we talk about realization, a lot of times what we're talking about is the attrition of the ego structure, the slow dissolution of the ego structure that prevents you from abiding in recognition of your true nature. So that it is often gradual. It's sometimes very gradual. So now for some people there are kind of apocalyptic events. The remainder of the ego is destroyed in a cataclysm. That's very dramatic, makes for good spiritual autobiographies. But for most people, it's not like that. Right? It's gradually worn away. Now, according to the Trika, this thing about recognizing essence nature happens in a moment, or maybe 3 moments, because there's 3 different aspects to be recognized. Again, I just said essence nature is not partitioned, and it's not, but still there's sort of 3 different aspects to be recognized that I give in the teaching on the 3 samaveshas, and there's a video on that that we can cite, or somebody will cite. Speaking of, David Hodgson asks, there's an interesting one. He asks, since awareness is formless and is my essential nature, and the capacity of awareness to be aware of itself resides in awareness, who is doing sadhana? Good question. Since only God can know God, the recognition that I am that which is aware of the awareness that I am is at the core of this process. That in fact awareness is doing everything. The idea of a separate self is just that, an idea, one which is naturally dissolved by awareness placing attention on itself all day long. Therefore, would embodiment be when attention is no longer required, as awareness has merged with and seeing, feeling itself as everything? I think instead of the word embodiment, you really want the word liberation there. But these days people are using the word embodiment to mean something like fully integrated. People say embodied to mean integrated, which is understandable, but it's led to kind of a semantic drift. So, for example, David, I think here you mean to say really liberation is when attention is no longer required, or effort is no longer required. Okay, but let's get back, let's rewind a bit in this kind of subtle question. I'll post it in the chat window for those watching live, because I know it's a little hard to follow. This question is quite subtle and profound. Since awareness is formless and my essential nature, and the capacity of awareness to be aware of itself resides in awareness, who is doing sadhana? I mean, the only real sadhana is the one. It's the process of the one realizing itself. And then pasted on top of that, there's this imagination of a separate self struggling through the spiritual journey, climbing the mountain, right? That's just an imagination. It's a kind of imagination pasted on top of what's really happening, which is this process whereby awareness is inevitably coming to realize itself through you and as you, right? Because awareness sort of, this is hard to put into words, but it seeks to wake up to itself in all these, in every possible form, in and through every possible form, like all rivers seek the ocean, but they're all just water. It's all the one. Imperfect analogy. Anyway. Okay, so David says awareness is in fact doing everything. Yes. The idea of a separate self is just that, an idea. Yes. One which is naturally dissolved by awareness placing attention on itself, awareness becoming aware of itself. Yes. And I want to point out, David has a wonderful phrase here that I don't know if he even realized, but it's this expanded version, really, of the of this. Can you close that door? This expanded version of the phrase that we find in the Hebrew Bible, right? So when Moses asks God, "Who are you?" right? The response comes, Eya, Asher, Eya. How do you pronounce this? Is that right? Yeah. I am that I am. That's the voice of God responding to the question, who are you? I am that I am. And look what David wrote here, I think in just spontaneous expression, you know. He said, the recognition that I am that which is aware of the awareness that I am is at the core of this process. So let's get the essence here. I am that which is aware of the awareness that I am. Now, from a kind of logical mind point of view, this might not really quite make sense or seem to be just redundant or something. But I think it is. I think it is a way of, it's an expanded version of that statement. I am that I am. I am that which is aware of the awareness that I am. So oftentimes the answer to people's question is there in the question. And this is one of those times. Okay, moving on. There's more good questions. So Frederick asks about Pratibhā, intuitive insight, the arising of intuitive insight. And Pratibhā is really, not easily translatable, but intuitive insight is good enough for short translation. And he says, I understand about Pratibhā in terms of feeling a pull to turn left instead of right, or to call someone who comes to mind, or to open a book to a particular page. But he says, I don't really understand about Pratibhā in some other senses or some other examples. He refers to this example whereby I invoke Pratibhā, to explain how this retreat center came about. And he says, how can a country call to you to place the institute center there? Pratibhā is very, 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 very hard to talk about in words because it is fundamentally non-verbal. It's totally non-verbal. But, so I'll try, but you just got to realize all the words are really, really, really just like metaphors. But Pratibhā, see, you limit Pratibhā, you limit this intuitive insight when you think it only applies to certain things or in certain ways, But Pratibhā is unlimited. It can apply to anything in any way. It can guide you in anything, right? Because Pratibhā is not a mind, and it's not part of your mind, okay? It doesn't rely on mental constructs. It is part of the entire pattern of life energy. It is the pattern of life energy. It's the pattern of life energy as it moves in the locus of awareness called you, right? So Pratibhā can perfectly well operate even in relation to a place you've never been, or a person you've never met. You can feel this call to meet somebody that you've never met. And in this case, the thing is, as soon as you try to put it into words, it sounds a little bit kind of too magical or too it sounds like too much of a kind of claim of spiritual insight, because it's not because it's not personal. Pratibhā is available to anyone who learns how to listen. It's not a function of being spiritually advanced or enlightened or something. Pratibhā is available to anyone who learns how to listen deeply. And you don't need to be, some degree of awakened or liberated. But anyway, I felt, okay, so said it's hard to put into words, but, it's one way that you can really work with Pratibhā is that when you face one direction, you feel a kind of yes, and you face another direction, you feel less yes, or maybe an absence of yes, or maybe even a no. Usually it's just an absence of yes. But this facing thing can work even for things that are not tangible or spatial, right? You just make them spatial, right? So you can put job opportunities, situate them around you in space, and then face one way and face the other, and feel what your energy body does. Feel if it brightens, feel if your physical body softens or opens, feel if there's a kind of a sense or a feeling or a conviction of, yes, somehow that feels right. Don't know why, but it does. So in the same way then, when I was sort of feeling, where's our retreat center going to be, there were so many possibilities, you know. India, Australia, Bali, Italy, Arizona, and the list goes on. But in Portugal was on the table somehow. I don't know why it was on the table, because I had never been to Portugal. Basically, nobody I knew at the time had been to Portugal. But it was on the table. And when I faced that direction, I would feel this quiet yes that I didn't feel as strongly for any of the others, right? And so then it's a kind of wait and see, wait for ripeness, see what happens, you know. So that slowly got stronger, you know, and Portugal sort of started to clarify a couple of years before there was any evidence, you know, meaning to say, I still didn't know anyone in Portugal. I hadn't been there. There was no logical reason to think that the retreat center would be here, right? And yet Pratibhā, you know, started to clarify maybe a little less than 2 years before last November, which is when we acquired this retreat center. And it's a long story, and I don't want to tell the whole, maybe there'll be a time to tell the whole story. But then when ripeness comes, when you've been kind of listening the whole time, and ripeness finally comes, it's like a domino fall. The first domino falls, and all the others go, you know, and everything can happen very, very quickly, and indeed it did. So, you know, a friend of mine who's also kind of tapped into Pratibhā, who lives here in Portugal, and see, that person didn't live in Portugal a year prior, right? So this is now, I'm now in last October in the narrative, October 2019, and this friend of mine who lived in Portugal by then but hadn't a year before was like, saw this place that I'm sitting in now on a website, you know, bed and breakfast for sale, and it was a website with hundreds of properties. And she got a little Pratibhā hit, and she sent it over to me. It's like, could this be the place? And I saw it and kind of and went sort of ding, you know, sort of green light. And see, if I get into the details, you guys, you're gonna think I'm crazy. You're gonna think this is such an irresponsible way to operate, right? Because I didn't look at the pictures, I didn't research it or anything. I was just like, okay, Pratibhā says yes, provisional yes. Next step, get people whose Pratibhā I trust to go to the site and look at it for me, which I did. A couple people then went and checked the place out, and they gave a thumbs up, and the people who owned it said, we need to sell it right away. We have a medical issue, need to move back to, you know, Holland and da-da-da. So you gotta make a decision. You gotta make a decision in like the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, because otherwise someone else, this other person we have waiting in the wings, is gonna buy it. So I was checked in with Pratibhā. Pratibhā says yes, and we're like, okay, we're gonna buy it. And then, you know, just put out the call for investors. All the right people showed up at the right time. And there's much more to it than that. It's also about finding like amazing, skilled, and trustworthy lawyers in a country where there's not so many of them. That had to happen. Everything fell into place very rapidly, and we bought the place within a few weeks, within those 2 weeks, whatever it was. And yeah, from a kind of logical point of view, totally irresponsible. We didn't do our due diligence on like, is there enough, is the water table here strong enough, because this region is getting slowly drier and drier with climate change, There were so many things we should have checked and didn't. But I trust Pratibhā. I've been doing this for years now, and she never leads me astray. And she said yes. And everything worked out. And like then only later, months later, did we realize how lucky we got, right? This is the perfect place. You look at other properties around here, this place is like 5 times more beautiful, you know? The person who planted the trees and did the original landscaping was very, 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 very good. There's like 3 natural wells on the property. The list goes on about how lucky we are, but it's not magic. It's just that you can trust Pratibhā. Now, not to say that if you listen to Pratibhā, everything always goes perfectly, because sometimes if you need to like learn something, if you need to learn something in a big way, Pratibhā will happily lead you right into a shit show fiasco for you to learn from, right? It just so happens that wasn't the case in this time. So it's really no guarantee. Listen to this intuitive insight that everything's always going to go well according to your mind. But if you listen to Pratibhā, you will always look back and say, that was exactly what I needed. That was the perfect thing to break my ego open, or whatever it was. Yeah, you could translate Pratibhā divine intelligence, or the innate intelligence of embodied consciousness. When Pratibhā moves towards spiritual awakening, we call her Kundalini. Same thing, same power, same energy, just, moving towards spiritual awakening in particular, rather than something else, like, which it can be applied to anything, though, anything at all, because nothing's, separate from or outside of spirit. Okay. And there's even more questions that are really good. Nora says, Pratibhā could be leading you to a necessary doom. Sure, sometimes it's possible, It could be, we're just getting into speculation here, but it could be that somebody's Pratibhā, they're listening, and their intuitive insight, leads them into a situation in which they end up dying, but thousands more are saved, something like that. Because Pratibhā is not personal. Pratibhā is not all about your interests, because you are a fictional construct. The you that you think you are is a fictional construct, and that Pratibhā doesn't acknowledge, right? But Pratibhā does acknowledge the benefit of all beings, which sounds like a contradiction because people think that's a construct, that's a mental construct, but it's not. Ecosystems tend towards harmony. They harmonize themselves even though there's no brain involved. It's just the ecosystem itself. Ecosystems tend towards harmony, and they find that harmony. They find a delicate ecological balance. And then if something comes in that disrupts that balance, again, the ecosystem starts moving towards harmony with the new situation, right? It might take a long time, but it does. It's a natural process, right? So in the same way that ecosystems naturally tend towards harmony, a delicate ecological balance, in the same way, Pratibhā tends towards the benefit of all beings. And that benefit, of course, is not personal, but it does include you. So if you're looking for an infallible guide that'll always make sure that you end up on top, that's not Pratibhā. There's no such infallible guide. Okay, so this maybe segues into the next question. Well, can you shed some light on the concept of there being no right or wrong versus seeking human justice when there has been questionable moral behavior? So the question being, how do we know when to take action to prevent further injustice and when to allow it to just be, or forgive, or let karma unfold? Example, This person says, example, child molestation. Well, in a sense, that's a bad example. People like to go for the kind of, in our community especially, people like to go for the most hardcore example. But in this case, that's a bad example because it's an easy one, because you know what to do. If somebody's molesting kids and shows no signs of stopping, we all agree they need to be restrained and warehoused, right? Now, they don't need to be necessarily put in a completely broken, counterproductive prison system like the US has. That's why I use the word warehoused, right? Because, in fact, there are much better things we could do with people who are a danger to others. And that's another topic for another time. But, so again, that example is in a sense, right, too easy then, because we all agree that that person needs to be protectively restrained and warehoused, right? And perhaps they can show evidence of truly changing, and then they're safe to release to society later. But what about tougher examples? What about examples when it's less black and white, of which there are many? This is a good question then, If there's no right or wrong, according to the Tantric view, if right and wrong are mental constructs, how do we know when to take action to prevent further injustice and when to allow it to just be or let karma unfold? Well, the answer, again, from a spiritual point of view, which doesn't work from a criminal justice point of view with the society we currently have, the answer is Pratibhā. Because Pratibhā knows, but most people don't know how to access that or get an accurate read on it, But Pratibhā knows, meaning to say, let's say you've witnessed somebody has done something that has caused harm. And that itself is a problematic statement, because how do we define harm, etc., etc.? It's, what definitely constitutes harm and what doesn't. Is it always harm if the person thinks they've been harmed? We can definitely find counterexamples that would problematize that stance. But anyway, let's table all that, or bracket it, whatever the right verb is, put that aside for now, and just ask, okay, somebody has done something that caused harm. Do we take action to prevent further injustice? And again, you don't even need the concept justice or injustice, right? Because the question is, is it likely that this person is going to cause further harm or not? And this question is explored by a great neuroscientist, David Eagleman, in his article "The Brain on Trial," which I love and heartily recommend at every available opportunity, because he rightly says, when neurology has definitively proved, which it hasn't yet, but when neurology has definitively proven that free will, as we ordinarily understand it, is an illusion, then upon what basis will our criminal justice system operate? Because it currently operates on the basis of the idea that the person chose A but could have chosen B. They chose to do a bad, wrong thing that hurt people when they could have made another choice, and therefore they should be punished for their wrongdoing. When that entire philosophical premise is undone, upon what basis will our justice system operate? He rightly says it could only operate, the only sane basis would be developing a science of accurately predicting whether the person is likely to cause further harm. So this would be an advanced science of psychology and neurology and behavioral genetics, right? But it's possible. We could accurately predict with time whether a person is likely to cause further harm. Then that's the basis on which you incarcerate them or warehouse them. Not on the basis of what they did in the past, but what they're likely to do in the future. So, in the absence of that kind of rigorous science, a well-developed access to Pratibhā is pretty important, because you just feel into that intuitive insight, and Pratibhā is a feminine word, she says, stay away from that person, right? You guys already know this. You've already done this, right? Especially, I would say, women who have had to develop their Pratibhā in order to be safe, right? Now, sometimes it's not Pratibhā, sometimes it's just unresolved past trauma asserting itself. But I've seen it, the case. I've seen it happen where a lot of women, they have this instinct. That's someone to stay away from, and they don't know why. There's no logical, he seems fine on the surface and on paper, and they're right, oftentimes. And anyway, this is not to say that women have more access to Pratibhā. It's just that in our society, because of its kind of patriarchal structure, they've had to develop that instinct more accurately because they're less safe, as a sort of class of people. That's a whole nother topic, right? But I'm just saying, when you see someone who's done harm, then regretting their actions, and they seem to really be contrite, and they seem to have learned something. They seem shocked that they caused harm, or shocked at the degree of the harm that they caused, and they are trying to make amends. Pratibhā knows whether that is an act or whether that's genuine. But this is where resolving trauma comes in, because the more unresolved trauma you have, the harder it is to get a good read on Pratibhā, right? Because unresolved trauma can reassert itself as what seems like a hunch, but it's actually a fear response based on past experience, not present reality. So that's a brief exploration of that fascinating and important topic. Johnny says it's a lot like Ritambhara in the Yoga Sutra. Sure, depending on whose exposition of Ritambhara you're following, could be identical to what we mean by Pratibhā here, or not. Sorry, so I wasn't sufficiently clear, because Dave is saying, Dave says, yikes, incarceration for a crime that hasn't been committed. Wait, are we talking about Minority Report situation? No. I'm sorry, I meant, and David Eagleman meant, when a person has committed a crime and you're trying to assess the likelihood of reoffending. And if the if the science were able to show that the likelihood of reoffending is very, very, very low, that person should not be incarcerated. But we are talking about somebody who has committed a crime and might do so again. Obviously, it would be morally indefensible to incarcerate someone for a crime they've never committed and only might. What might be morally defensible is keeping an eye on them, right? Behavioral genetics does show that people with certain genetic makeups are much, 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 much more likely to be violent, way more likely. And that doesn't mean you should put them in jail. It means maybe you should keep an eye on them. Okay, so there's that article. Nora posted the link. Thank you. In the live chat. Okay, last. Oh, we're at 108. But I do want to do one more question. Is that okay? Vanya often asks profound questions. She's a philosophy student. 1. I am curious about the metaphor of digestion used in Classical Tantra in general. This is because I have never encountered such a way to think about how we consume our experiences. For example, digestion of emotions and experiences, and that's usually what we're talking about. We're not. The metaphor of digestion is not used in the context of digesting knowledge. It's used in the context of digesting emotions and experiences, especially intense experiences. And samskāras, digesting samskāras. So she says, why is this, the metaphor that's used when we could have said processing or reflection? And also, what's the Sanskrit word for digestion? Well, the Sanskrit word is paka. Paka, simple little word. Paka also means ripening. It also means cooking, for that matter. There's three primary meanings for paka: ripening, cooking, and digestion. In a sense, this is the only metaphor that they could have used, they being the past masters, right? Because it's the only one that really fits as well as it does. So one way to think about this is, look, when the physical body digests its food well, you have energy. You have energy to think and to move your body and to do all kinds of things. And when it doesn't digest its food well, you don't have as much energy. You experience fatigue and suppressed immune system and so on. So digestion is pretty crucial, right? Now, when you can't digest something, some physical food we're talking about here, there's two things. One of two things is going to happen, or both. You're going to throw it up. You're going to throw up food that you can't digest, or a bacteria you can't digest. Or if you don't throw it up, it poisons you, even if the poison is temporary. It toxifies in your system. Now, this gives us a great metaphor then for emotional, what we do with emotions and experiences, right? We seek to digest them. If you can't digest your emotions, you're either going to throw them up on someone else in the form of blame or emotional dumping, or if you don't throw your emotions up on someone else, you're going to hold them inside and they're going to toxify and poison you if you can't digest them, that is, right? So it's a very, very nice kind of close and symmetrical, if that's the word, analogy here. Now, if you can digest your emotions and your experiences, they add to your total life energy. They enhance the experience of aliveness. They enhance the vibrancy of your aliveness. Now, digestion can be of an experience that just happened today, or of an experience that happened 20 years ago, or even 20 lifetimes ago. Right? If the samskara is still hanging out in the system, and remember, mercifully, most samskaras die with the body and the mind that they're associated with. Only on rare occasions do they carry over into another lifetime, according to the tradition. But some of them definitely do, and they can carry over from lifetime to lifetime, And, so I know some women who talk about the samskara, feeling the samskara in their body of having been burned as a witch. I don't know if that's true for sure, but I have no specific reason to disbelieve them either, and I think it very well could be true. So in super intense experience like that is more likely to carry over than some other kind of samskara. But anyway, the point is, digesting samskaras has the same effect on your energy body as digesting a new experience from today, meaning it adds to your total life energy. And so the energy body becomes very sort of vibrant when you are good at digesting, with lots of beneficial side effects. You tend to be healthier. You very, very rarely get sick when you have a vibrant and strong energy body. Because your immune system is stronger. The more and then the stronger your energy body is, the more challenging sorts of experiences you can digest. So it's kind of like a positive feedback loop in that sense, or a snowball rolling downhill, in the sense that the better you get at digesting, the more you can digest, and the more challenging and intense experiences you could digest. So if you develop a really strong energy body, you can also do work that would totally emotionally crush other people, and it doesn't have that same impact on you. You can process it. You can digest it. So this is just, again, a little capsule kind of summary of the importance of this teaching, which is explicated in chapter 11 of the Recognition Sutras. So if you don't have my book, buy it now at your friendly neighborhood bookstore, if there are bookstores anymore, or website. Recognition Sutras, chapter 11, among other sources, but that's an important one for this teaching on digestion. And Kshemarāja talks about hatha-pāka, sudden digestion, or powerful or forceful digestion. Hatha-pāka is when, as a result of spiritual practice, you're able to seize hold of your inner strength, your atma bala, your inner power, inner strength, and you realize that you can digest something really intense, really powerful, really major that you couldn't have digested before. And it can happen very suddenly and powerfully, and there can be a huge energetic release, and that's hatha-pāka, this kind of sudden digestion, in which you completely devour the experience without remainder, or the samskara of the experience. So that is something that some people just have an innate capacity for, but most people access that capacity through spiritual practice of an embodied kind, of a tantric kind, right? Not just any form of, because if you're just practicing a transcendentalist sort of practice in which you're kind of leaving your body behind, that doesn't help you develop a strong energy body. Okay, that was Vanya's question number 1. Somebody in the live feed asks about TBI, traumatic brain injury. Any kind of injury that causes cognitive impairment, or for that matter, any kind of cognitive decline, doesn't pose any problem for somebody who's had a meditation practice before that point, right? Like anyone, for somebody who's had a well-developed meditation practice, Alzheimer's or any sort of cognitive decline is no problem whatsoever. It just means they get to, their meditation is more easeful than ever, But if you haven't had a meditation practice before that point, it is usually too late. That's a big topic. I'm just touching on it there. Last question, Vanya's number 2. I have begun to practice experiencing, feeling, perceiving as something holistically aesthetic. I've begun to practice experiencing, feeling, or perceiving as something holistically aesthetic. As a result, appreciating those moments as something beautiful becomes a new and easier way of living. And she mentions that cultivating the ability to experience painful moments as something beautiful as well. As a result, even though this practice is personally rewarding, should this be applied in a broader world where there is injustice? I guess my question is, how far can the practices of Classical Tantra, which is spiritual and philosophical, be stretched onto social and political domains? Is it unfair to ask for social and political answers from Classical Tantra? Yes. Thank you for asking that, right? Because what most people do is they're like, how does this apply to our social justice issues? And almost nobody asks what you just did there, Vanya, which is it unfair to ask for social political answers from Classical Tantra? Yes, it is, because it, as a spiritual movement, it, totally did not even attempt to address those questions, right? And you might say, well, it should have. Well, but that wasn't the way that things were seen at the time, right? Now, having said that, Tantric communities did institute policies that had social, cultural, political implications, for us at least. For example, within a tantric community, a kula, the practice was of radical egalitarianism, meaning to say, the person's, the former caste or social status of initiates was held to be meaningless within the context of spiritual community. And indeed, at least in some lineages, anyone within a spiritual community who even alluded to the former caste of a fellow initiate would be asked to leave the community. That's how serious they were about these values of radical egalitarianism, regardless of gender or sex or social status or caste or any of those things. But they never, strangely to us, they never attempted to extrapolate those values of radical egalitarianism in the public sphere. They never agitated for those values to be enacted in government or in law or in policy or in the public sphere in any way. Did they think about that? Who knows? They certainly didn't mention it. So it can be hard to understand how differently people are kind of thinking about reality and thinking about society 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, you know. But yeah, so Classical Tantra doesn't provide social and political answers, but like I said, it did have teachings that could have social and political implications should we seek to extrapolate from them into the social and political sphere, which I think is not wrong to do. But for that matter, Classical Tantra doesn't provide answers to your relationship questions either, which surprises people even more, right? Okay. There's more that could be said about that, and undoubtedly more that should be said about that, but maybe that's good for now. Well, one more thing, which is that I would say those, and there are such people, who say that spiritual traditions should not be mapped onto social or political realities, I would also argue with them. I would dispute with them, right? Because I would say, look, there are implications in non-dual philosophies such as Tantra for how we should relate to the natural world, the natural environment, right, our ecology, and there are implications for how we should relate to each other. And that one of those implications is radical egalitarianism, that the humanity of all human beings is equal, is inherently equal. And I personally would love to see a world in which that value was enacted rigorously in social policy and politics as well. I don't expect to see that in my lifetime, but I think those who really do want to apply these values, these spiritual values, in the socio-political sphere, I support that. I think that's great. It's not my job. But I do think those people who wish to silo the tradition from those concerns are, I would say, there's no reason to do that and no benefit. Okay. Nice to be with you all. Seems like a good Q&A. It's more fun on Zoom where people can say things. It's not just me talking the whole time, but we're not on Facebook that much longer. Anyway. Finally, Kaushalya, who started us off with the very first question of this satsang session, says, being able to digest emotions to enhance my aliveness is the better language I needed rather than be in my stuff. Great. Glad to hear that. My capacity to digest samskāras has expanded, and the vantage point is the self, the divine self, the supreme self, due to spiritual practice. Thank you for realigning me with this and the fact that truth is nonverbal. Thank you. Glad to be of service. Om. We do these Facebook Live Q&As every 2 weeks now. Every 2 weeks. And on the other weeks, we do live Q&A on Patreon. So if you want a live Q&A every week in your life, please join the Patreon page. And if you want Sanskrit lessons also, as I mentioned earlier, and lots of other goodies, please join the Patreon page. But these Q&As on the Facebook group will continue every other week. And a big shout out to Florentine, who has been doing an amazing content curating job and who has organized all the questions asked in all of these Q&A videos and indexed them so you can find the answer to a question that's already been asked that you didn't know had been asked until you check her document. So please do check her document and find if your question's already been answered. And if not, then ask it. And yeah, and in the Facebook group, Florentine's been doing a great job with just knowing where all the content is and linking people to it. So, and she's one of our admins. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being the most beautiful community ever. See you tomorrow for Near Enemies bonus webinar. Om.